This is Unsiloed, brought to you by Alumni FM, connecting people through stories.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Lynda Gratton, who is a professor at London Business School. She's also the principal at HSM Advisory, which I think heads up this Future of Work Consortium, which includes many, many companies from around the world. And of course, she's the author of a ton of books. I think you said your 10th book. There's so many books here. There's, right, The 100-Year Life. There's this one right here, Hot Spots. Why some teams, workplaces, and organizations buzz with energy and others don't, which I think became the start of a really big movement. In fact, my former dean recommended that book to me right over a decade ago, which is where I first found out about your work and started really digging into it. You've got this one called The Key, How Corporations Succeed by Solving the World's Toughest Problems. You've got The Shift, Living Strategy, The Democratic Enterprise, Strategic HR Management, and of course, the most recent book, which is called Redefining Work, out this spring. Welcome, Lynda.
Thank you, Greg. And thank you so much for having me on Unsiloed.
Well, of course, I have to have you on Unsiloed because of you praised the boundary spanners in Hotspots. And so we'll have to kind of dig into the boundary spanners. But I want to start off with the issue that everybody's talking about, of course, which is the impact of the pandemic on the workplace and the world. And I was just having a conversation with some students recently about this. And they said, well, how did the pandemic fundamentally change the world? And I think that I don't think it really did. I think what it did is it maybe accelerated things, but I think everything that came about as a result of the pandemic would have happened anyway. It just would have happened a little more slowly. In particular, this move from, the co-location, both temporally and physically around the workplace. And I think you in the book, you say something like, this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to really examine closely, right? What is it about work that we want to keep, and what is it that we want to reject? And so, channeling one of Bill Clinton's advisors, don't let a crisis go to waste. I'd love to talk about kind of what the best companies have done as a result of this crisis with respect to how they organize work. And I think you really, in your book, not only analyze that, but also you offer some guidance. You have a wonderful website where you offer a kind of a 4-step process that companies can dig into to try to embrace these new changes.
Well, first of all, Greg, thank you for that introduction. And thank you for reminding me of all those. I think you had every single book there. You might have missed out The Democratic Enterprise, but the truth is only my mother read The Democratic Enterprise. So if anybody out there has read The Democratic Enterprise, I will send you a bottle of champagne. So I think it accelerated, but actually I don't think we'd ever be in the place that we are now, Greg, in terms of how people are working. And I'll tell you why I say that. And you perhaps remember I did a Harvard Business Review article in March of 2021. Yeah, it was the front cover actually. I'm looking at it now, called Doing Hybrid Right. And I started with Fujitsu. And the reason I did that is that, Fujitsu is a Japanese company. It's got the most traditional Japanese ways of working. And yet within 2 weeks, they moved 60,000 people out of the office into their homes. I don't think Fujitsu would have done that in the next 100 years. So I did think it actually didn't simply accelerate. It actually forced people to change in a way that they never thought was believable. Mm-hmm. And in that process, one of the things that someone asked me at the very beginning is, what are the good practices? And I actually said at that stage, I don't think there's such a thing as a good practice. I think what we're doing is we're all going through a process of experimentation. And that's really why I wrote the book, because I wanted to show that, in fact, what's really important about this time that we're at now is none of us know what the outcomes are. I just spoke, only this morning to to Microsoft, in fact, and they don't know what the outcome is. So if they don't know, I don't know who does. So we are in this period of experimentation. So what I tried to do with the book is to say, look, there are 4 steps you need to go through. And that anyone who knows about design and systems thinking, and Greg, I bet a lot of your listeners do, will know that it's a design process. It says, first of all, you have to understand, and then you have to experiment and model, and then you have to test things out, and then you have to try and enact them. And that's what great companies are going through now. So, for example, Microsoft right now is saying, we are listening very deeply to what our employers are saying and what they want. And we're also looking outside to see what others are doing. And the combination of those sort of data sets, the research that's coming out of that, is helping us to understand what the guidelines are for how we redesign work. And you know yourself that right now there's groups of experiments, some of which are about place, office versus home. But I think as importantly are the experiments about time. When do we work? What days do we work on? What hours do we work? And how we give ourselves time to do that amazing sort of focused work, which is so incredibly crucial for humans, the time when you're thinking and pondering and using your brain. So I think it's an astoundingly interesting time. And I just can't help but watch it every moment of the day. I kept a journal, actually, Greg, from the very first day, which for me was the 24th of March, 2020. And I think I'm now into about 19 journals of this, just really writing down what I'm hearing.
Mm-hmm. Well, I like how you used what I think most people in the Bay Area would recognize as kind of the design thinking process, right? The 4 steps or stages. I mean, I think you added some tweaks to it, but really, I think you're emphasizing that this is sort of how you tackle any kind of change, right? How you tackle any kind of problem solving, right? You have to start with observation and understanding. And I think that at that phase, what you're really trying to understand is the work itself, right? You're trying to understand what exactly is it that your, company is doing and what exactly is it that leads to, the productivity that you're trying to preserve or enhance. But I want to go back kind of historically, because you do a little bit of history here, and I'm a historian by training. And you talk, there's a little micro history of the office, and you refer to what's called the Model T version of the office. And, where everything's kind of co-located 9 to 5. And this reminded me when I was growing up as a kid, my dad was an executive in a clothing factory here in the United States, one of the last kind of clothing factories in a downtown metropolitan area. And it was a tall building that had 8, 9 stories. The bottom 2 stories were executive offices, and then the top 7 stories were the factory. And I remember, because I would go down to the office, sometimes I would work in the factory and hang out at my dad's office, that, at 5 o'clock, right, the alarm would go off and everything would stop. I mean, all the workers would, just stop what they were doing, and they would leave the building, they'd flow out to the subway and go home. But what was even more interesting to me was that all the executives would stop, and they would all kind of leave and go out the back door to the parking lot and jump in their cars and, drive home to the suburbs. And that was sort of that was just sort of the way of things. And we kind of clung to that a bit. Do you think that we were sort of prisoners of this model for a long time? I mean, you mentioned Goldman Sachs and so forth, but how much of this is, I don't know, just an unwillingness to question, or how much of it was sort of an unwillingness to question the status quo?
Well, I think the word "a prisoner of the model," Greg, is just a brilliant way of describing it. I think we were prisoners of the model, and if we go back even further than our dads, and my dad would have had a similar experience, by the way. We could go back to the Industrial Revolution and the factories where people came from the countryside into working in factories, and that meant that they were suddenly co-located. They were in a factory together. Machines were determining when they worked. They worked very long hours, as you know. They would have worked longer than 5 o'clock, but they all did have very set times. And I think this idea of bringing people together in a factory-like situation was really the vision that we had of work. That's what work was. It was something that was co-located. It was often, many hours away from where the home was. And it was something that men did. And, your mum probably stayed at home. Mine certainly did. So it also had big gender implications. I felt, obviously, part of the reason I've written 10 books, Greg, is I've just felt really since I worked on a factory in making chocolates, packing chocolates, during my PhD, I just felt that this was not the way to work. And I suppose I keep battering on with each book, really making that point over and over again. And now I think we have a chance of changing models. And here's why. I don't think there was any great strategy on the part of CEOs to say, this is the time. I think simply as humans, we know that habits change within 12 weeks. So I said at the beginning of the pandemic to myself and to others who were prepared to listen to me, if this thing goes on for more than 12 weeks, we will change our habits. Well, 2 years later, and our habits have changed, our behaviors have changed, our skills have changed. You and I are talking so easily on a platform. And I spoke, a half an hour ago to somebody else on another platform in Boston. This morning, I was talking to people in Japan. We would never have done that before the pandemic. We didn't do it, and now we do. And so we've learnt a lot of skills. Technology has stepped up in a way that I think everyone's sort of been astounded at. We've taken it for granted now. And there is absolutely no way back. There is no way back. So either we take this opportunity to say, how would we like to work? What would it be to work in a way that helps us, that supports our families, that helps our communities, that helps us to grow, that helps us to work until we're 70s? Part of, from reading The 100-Year Life, Greg, is that if you live to 100, which some people will, you work until you're in your mid-70s. That's the economics of long lives. And so, when I said to people, you're going to work into your 70s, lots of people said, I can't carry on working like this until I'm in my 70s. Well, now we have a chance to change.
Yeah, I can't imagine not working, but I think it's specifically because of the work that I do, right? I mean, if I was a coal miner, I could definitely imagine, not working when I was that old. But you mentioned these digital skills and these digital capabilities and these digital tools that companies have invested in, and I guess part of it is that there's a fixed cost. There's like an upfront cost, an integration cost, or a skill acquisition cost, and I guess it's very easy for companies and individuals to kind of procrastinate, kind of kick the can down the road. I mean, one thing that I think the pandemic has done at my institution is it's completely changed the viewpoint on kind of software licensing, right? So, before the pandemic, my school did not license Slack. It didn't license Zoom. It didn't. I mean, it kind of did, but even Microsoft Office 365 was pushing things a bit far for the IT departments in my schools. So I think there's like a fixed cost that we're kind of more or less forced to absorb, almost like the fixed cost associated with developing nuclear technology during World War II. Is that part of the story?
Yeah, absolutely. Going back to the Fujitsu experience, if I had gone over to Japan, I go to Japan a lot, and I had said to Fujitsu 5 years ago, you absolutely have to have more flexible ways of working, which in fact I did say that at the time. They would have done what any well-paid executive would have done, which is to create a strategy group to look at it and a project team. And they'd have said, well, the project team will probably take about a year to come back and tell us what we should be doing. And then it'll take, so the whole thing, in other words, the can would have been kicked down the road and then it would have been kicked into the long grass, which it has been over and over in organizations. And I think you're absolutely right that there's no question there is a fixed cost. There's a fixed cost to organizations and indeed to individuals. I mean, you and I, Greg, are university lecturers. We both had to learn how to run a hybrid MBA program or a hybrid postgraduate program. That was a huge fixed cost for me. It took me, a great deal of time to learn that. So, but we had to do it. And organizations had to absorb that fixed cost. So I think, one of the reasons I wrote the book, and I wrote it as fast as I could, in fact, in Penguin, bless them, published it as fast as they could in the UK, and MIT Press published it as fast as they could in the US, is because I felt that about now, and I'm speaking April, May of 2022, people would begin to say, I think we could just go back to how we were. And I thought it was really important that all of us together said, no, we're not going to go back. There were many things wrong with how we worked. We have had, as you rightly say, I love the point about the fixed costs. Let's now build something different. And that, I think, that's why I say it's a unique opportunity. I've been at London Business School for more than 30 years. I've never had a moment where I felt so positive about the way work could change.
Well, let's talk about two things, because you talk about productivity a lot in the book. And so we need to kind of dig into the things that drive productivity. And I love your framework, right? Your energy, focus, coordination, and cooperation framework. I think it's brilliant. But then there's also this idea of kind of, treating the employees more like customers or more like human beings, right? And giving them more, what they're looking for. Now, I don't think, even though you can analyze these separately, I think they ultimately converge. I think you will get more productivity when you customize the work to suit the needs and preferences of your employees. But let's just start with productivity. And I think that there's a debate on this. There are people that say productivity increased when people worked from home, and there were studies like this on call center employees and so forth that predate the pandemic. But then there's quite a bit of critics who say, well, that only applies to certain types of work, and it comes at the expense of creativity, and it comes at the expense of innovation. And even before the pandemic, people like Marissa Mayer, right, were like, we got to come back to work. We need that energy that we have in the workplace. So what is the status of the science around productivity? And I guess I know you're going to say it depends on which dimension you're looking at, but what's the broad overview? Is there a consensus? And can we throw out the data from before the pandemic because things have changed?
Well, the study you're referring to, of course, is Nick Bloom's study on call center workers in China, and I bet that Nick never expected to have that study so referenced, because when he did the study, nobody was much interested in it. It was just a study of, remote working in a call center in China. And of course, once the pandemic hit, it was one of the few actual proper studies, with Group A and Group B, that got a sense of what was going. Now, what Nick found there is that we found two things I found really fascinating at the time. The first is that people working from home were as productive or more productive. And the reason they were as or more productive is they worked longer hours. Mm-hmm. And that, by the way, is true in general, that the reason I've been more productive, and perhaps you have as well, Greg, is that I've actually worked harder than I would have done before the pandemic, partly because there was honestly nothing else to do. So we were all just working crazily. The second thing he found is that when, after 6 months, he gave people the opportunity to either stay working at home, which is what they were doing, or to come back to the office, quite a high proportion said, I want to come back. I'm feeling pretty tired. I'm feeling, as if my sort of social group is reducing. And I think that Nick actually, in that study, which was pre-pandemic, found a couple of things which were going to then play out in the pandemic. The first one was about productivity, and the second one was about social networks, which is why in the book, as you saw, I talk a lot about social networks, because I think knowledge flows are really important. I start with the design process by asking what helps people to be productive. And the reason I did that, I deliberately didn't start with a question, what do people want? Because my view, and Nick, Nick, I'm sure, could have called me an old cynic on this one. But my view is that if you do something in an organization that inadvertently reduces productivity, the next CEO or the next recession or the next inflation, it'll all be pulled out. So you have to be convinced that what you're doing is helping people to be more productive. But what I said about productivity is there are four aspects of productivity we have to consider. The first is the way that you're working helping you to be energized? Secondly, do you have tasks that you do in your work where you have to focus? Part of the work that you and I do, Greg, as academics, is we sit on our own in a study for 4 hours at a time thinking about stuff and conceptualizing stuff. Actually, quite a lot of jobs have aspects like that because, frankly, in many jobs, the boring stuff is already being done by AI and machines. So humans more and more are doing that sort of focused, thoughtful judgment, decision-making stuff. And that you need to be, that's what you have to do when you're on your own, when you're undisturbed. And then there's coordination and cooperation. And coordination tasks, managing large projects, could actually be done virtually. Most of them really don't need face-to-face. So that leads now to cooperation. And so, where we are, I think, in terms of productivity, and this is, the debate that we're having this week, as it were, is as people come back to the office, what is it that they can do to create as much value around any task they have, which is about cooperation? Let me give you an example. I was talking to a senior investment banker in New York last week, and she said, Lynda, I've just commuted 1.5 hours from Connecticut to come into Manhattan, and I'm going to commute 1.5 hours back. And all I've done all day, the answer to this, Greg, she said, I've been sitting on Zoom meetings. I don't know why I'm here. So, we have to make, if we want people back in the office, and I think most companies do for at least some of the time, we have to make it a very attractive proposition. So that's why I started with productivity. And then I looked at networks, and simply to say that actually, if you look at why people are productive, it's often to do with the networks they're in. So as we redesign work, how could we make those invaluable networks stronger and make sure they're not depleted? And then finally, I asked about the individual. How could we build a way of working that suits them as individuals? And that's always been really hard to do because organizations, obviously, it's easier from a bureaucratic perspective to lump employees together. So I'm 67, for example. So you lump actually there's nobody who's 67 working in a company, but let's say there were, you lump them all together, or you lump all the women together, all the mother. And that's ridiculous because we're all very different. So what we're seeing now, which I find sort of fascinating, is a greater understanding that each human is different and what they want is different. It depends on their character, the job they do, their personal circumstances. So what we're now seeing emerging this month, as it were, is team agreements where teams sit down together and talk about how are we best going to manage both our productivity requirements, but also what we as individuals need. And I find that incredibly fascinating. The study I'm doing at the moment, actually, Greg, is about those team agreements.
Yeah, I mean, we talked earlier about how we both started teaching a course related to the future of work at the same time back in 2015. And, I mentioned that I didn't call mine future of work. I called it kind of, workplace analytics, workplace science. And the thing that really struck me is that, folks in HR, we're nowhere even close to where the folks in marketing were when it came to understanding individual differences, right? And I think it's in part because HR is just sort of seen as a cost function and not as not as a strategic part of the organization. In fact, when I proposed to one of my deans that I teach this class, and he said, "Well, why would anybody ever take a course on HR? Like, who cares about HR?" And it's like, well, look, it's kind of the big deal nowadays. But
yeah,
but
you never put HR. You never put HR in an MBA subject matter.
That's
I agree.
right. But,
that's why. But yeah.
But Netflix was, they said 10 years ago that these, these generic categories that the movie studios were using were total garbage. And yet, here we are in a world of HR using these broad categories of jobs and these broad categories of people taking the jobs. And it's almost like a taboo to treat people as individuals.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're so right, actually, Greg, to make the comparison between HR and marketing. it's really interesting that in the book, when I talk about organizations that have done, I think, sterling work in terms of understanding individual employees, that work has almost inevitably been done by the head of marketing. So the head of marketing has said, I want to use these marketing tools that we use, which, for example, look at customer life cycle, look at, whether your pain points, pain and gain points, all the things that are just normal everyday constructs for marketing. Human resources have not used those constructs. And so, in terms of unsiloed, where we've seen some really exciting and insightful work on understanding people and their jobs is because marketing concepts were brought into looking at what it is people want, what their pain points are, where they are in their development and so on.
Right. And so I want to just get back to productivity. And, some of the studies that we've done, empirical studies, I think one of the problems with them is that, it's hard to kind of make inferences about the future from the past because the technology is changing so rapidly. So for instance, if we're evaluating remote collaboration in a pre-Zoom world and then trying to make inferences about what it would be like, after we, become pretty fluent and conversant in technologies like Zoom, it's kind of like, seeing if autonomous vehicles can drive on our current highways and making inferences about how they would drive on a highway that was kind of redesigned for autonomy, right? I mean, that's why I think I like the test and learn. We're going to have to just continuously iterate on what we're doing.
Yeah. Well, I was talking to Microsoft this morning, and they were saying, they, like many technology companies, you'd find the same in IBM, you'd find the same in TCS. They have very strong lead and lag measures of what is going on in the organization at any time. So they ask 2 questions on a daily basis to a subsection of the whole employee group, which gives them a sense of how are people feeling right now about hybrid? What are they getting from it? How is it helping their performance? And I think that sort of data, which is really, lead data, it tells you what's happening today, is very important as they make decisions about what they're going to do with regard to the design of work. And in terms of lag, then they can also look back and look at productivity of groups and so on. So I think you're absolutely spot on there that the past work, research on things like the use of technology hasn't really have been is of no use actually during the pandemic because we all learned new skills. We did things differently and we encountered different problems. So for me, right now, I think the number one challenge that companies are facing, and this is quite a specific point, Greg, but it'll be interesting to hear what you think, is because Zoom and Microsoft Teams is so easy, people have just filled their diary with Microsoft. And I'm seeing, I talk to people 8 or 9 meetings a day, one after another. And that is proving to be massively, it burns out people. So, I think so what we're learning is, and this is you get burned out if you do 8 Zooms a day. So don't do them. So think about asynchronous ways of working. So switch your video off. So all the time you're getting really constant feedback about what is happening in your organization right now. And frankly, Greg, and I don't know if you feel this as well, I feel the people who are practicing the work now are way ahead of me as an academic because they've got lead data, daily lead data that they can actually say, this is what we're seeing right now, right today. So we're going through an incredible learning and also astonishing experiments. One of the things that are amusing me at the moment is I just keep a record of every experiment that I hear. And there's just endless, first mover advantages. Like, and I mentioned this in the book, one of the investment companies saying, you can work anywhere you want for 3 months a year. I mean, if I was in Goldman Sachs right now, I'd be thinking, hang on, why don't I have that? So there are like 4-day week in Europe. We're very hepped up about the 4-day week. I know that you in the US haven't got quite the same feeling about it, but we actually have experiments. Oxford and Cambridge together are running a whole series of experiments with 5 or 6 companies across Europe on the 4-day week. So I think this is the moment where you try out anything and just see how it works.
Now, Eric Schmidt just recently came out and said that, he doesn't understand remote work. He said, if you want to learn how to function in a large organization, if you want to learn the kind of rules of the trade, if you want to learn to become a manager and how to manage people, like you have to be in the office. I think not only just to practice, but to observe others. And in your book, you have these, you have a couple of these ideal customer profiles, one of which is an older person who's kind of well-established in the job, who is comfortable with remote because and again, there are a couple other characteristics. This person is a commuter, and so they're thrilled they don't have to commute. And then you've got this, and they have a large house, so they don't get on their spouse's nerves. But then you have this younger kind of employee that lives in a small, cramped apartment, relatively close to the office, who's just kind of getting her, finding her legs, and she's really kind of kneecapped by remote work. Do you think that that's just a temporary thing? I mean, obviously there's constant elements here, but when Eric Schmidt says you'll never learn how to manage if you're not in the workplace, is he really saying you'll never learn how to manage a Model T type office if you're not in the office? But if it's just that, like, who cares? Like, no one's going to need that skill anymore. And you're going to need a much more complex set of managerial skills that are, location agnostic. And so, is he basically just saying, you're not going to learn a skill that you don't need anymore?
Well, that's such a great question and such a great observation, Greg. And I think we can sort of take that question in a number of ways. The first thing is the leader as narrator. So I think more and more leaders now are stepping up and saying, this is what I believe. And I think that's great that they're doing that. I mean, they may not be right, but at least they're saying, this is my belief. And Eric has said, and others have joined him, especially those who are running investment banks, are saying, we want everybody in the office. It's a very special place. Something magical happens there. We want you there. But there's other people, and I was just listening just now, actually, or just earlier, to the CEO of Microsoft, who's saying, we want the data first to decide whether or not you are more productive. And so we're collecting the data. And once we've collected the data and learned from our experiments, we'll come back with it to you and tell you what we think it is. So I think, he's getting more of an experimental mindset. I think Eric's saying, I think it's hard for any CEO at the moment to. Everybody's looking to their CEO to tell them what do you want me to do? And so the easiest thing to do, as Eric said, and others said earlier, actually in the pandemic, is I want everybody back in the office. And you can see that for young people who are inexperienced, and I wrote about this sort of, I'm lucky enough in many ways to have a column at MIT Sloan. And the reason I say I'm lucky is that it just forced me to write something every 6 weeks. And that meant...
I've got this one here.
There it is. Yeah. And it just meant that, from the very beginning, every 6 weeks, I had to say, oh my God, and I wrote about the observed and the observing really early on in the pandemic. But it remains an issue. And, I don't think any organization, I think very few organizations are going to say, you will never get into the office again. I mean, one of the companies I wrote about was Artemis Connection. You perhaps remember that. And I wrote about it because it's a company that's entirely virtual. It was entirely virtual before the pandemic, and it remains so. And it's basically made out of people. It's made up of people who came out of McKinsey and BCG and wanted to do something different. So it's a strategy consulting practice. But I don't think many people are going to go that path of Artemis Connection. It takes a huge level of intentionality and understanding tacit knowledge and so on to do that. I think very few are going to say, we want you all back in the office all the time. I think what we'll move towards is hybrid. Now, as somebody from Microsoft said to me this morning, the problem with hybrid is it could be the worst of everything, the worst of all worlds. And right now, to be honest, it sort of feels like that, doesn't it? Though, I just went into the office at London Business School today, but there was nobody there. So I've made a and they will also have come in at a different time to see me, and I'm not going to be there. Or you've probably yourself been in a meeting where half the people have been on Zoom or Microsoft, a platform, and the other half are in the room, and that's horrible. So we have got to learn how to do this, and that's actually what I'm sort of focusing on right now. Is what are the tools and techniques and the ways of working that allow you to make hybrid work? Because I think we can make it work, but it has to be done much more intentionally. And there are companies, and Eric's might be one of them, where everybody has got to be back in the office. But if I don't know if you remember, Greg, you and I as university professors love 2x2s. And one of the ones I created for the book was a 2x2 along which one axis was just how much potential somebody has, from high to low potential. And along the other axis is how much flexibility they wanted. So if you're Goldman Sachs, you are actually fishing in a pool of people who are high potential who don't want flexibility. Now, I think that's a pretty small pool. And it might be, by the way, a pool of people who have other characteristics that bring them together. What you're missing out is anyone who is high performing or high potential and wants flexibility. So I think when Eric says that, I have no problem with that. And I didn't from the very beginning with Goldman saying we want everybody back. But there are consequences of those decisions, some of which are unintended, and they will be playing out over the next couple of years. And they will learn about that, and they'll either decide there are enough people in the world who have high potential and low needs of flexibility to fill those companies. And that's great. But there'll be lots of people that they're not going to be able to either attract or retain.
Yeah, so different companies may choose different policies and attract people with different preferences or personalities or working styles.
Well, that's just, I didn't mean to interrupt, Greg, but just to say, do you remember when earlier you said about the model Ford T? The reason I brought that in was to say, when our great-great-grandparents bought a car, they could only buy the Model Ford T and it could only be black. But what we're seeing now is massive variety. So my guess is, there'll be a lot of variety between companies as they decide how to build a way of working which both meets their needs for productivity and also which attracts and retains the sort of talent that they want.
It's like dine in versus take out, right?
It's yeah. Absolutely.
But the thing I think the thing that people are most worried about is, look, in your book Hotspots, like you really dial into what makes certain types of companies, really innovative and exciting, and you describe these hotspots, and I find it kind of hard to visualize a canonical hotspot that's entirely virtual.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, I just completed 2 weeks of immersion classes for HEC here in San Francisco. And, they delayed them and delayed them and delayed them. And I think they did that for good reason, because the energy and the collegiality and the enthusiasm and the need I say like philia, the camaraderie that is developed during that in-person experience, even if we weren't able to visit some of the big companies, we had to kind of invite them to a neutral location. The energy was palpable, and you just don't get that in kind of a remote setting, I think, at least, for now. So I like how you talk about, okay, there's coordination, there's cooperation, there are these different elements, and there's tacit and there's explicit knowledge, and there's, you basically break down the elements of what you're looking for and show that, well, different pieces are kind of, encouraged or discouraged in different types of environments. And then the other thing that I really liked was that you pointed out that, we were already, by moving from cubicles to open office, right? We were already doing a gigantic experiment on how people work, and that by the time we moved to fully open office, most people were kind of already collaborating almost entirely remotely, more or less anyway, with their headphones on.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, again, wonderful observations, Greg. And let me just make just talk about two of the things that you've mentioned. The one is this immersive experience of being face to face, and I feel that as well. And actually, one of the groups that I'm one of the sectors I'm really fascinated in at the moment is architects. So I spent last week with Foster and Partners, which is the group actually that designed the Apple headquarters, quite near you, that great big iconic building, and spoke to Stefan, who designed that. And of course, he could speak from now till eternity about the importance of face to face, because architects, that's what architects do. They design experiences that are about face-to-face. And architects will always talk to you about Burning Man and how important these cooperative experiences are. And they talk a lot about experiences. And I think that's just absolutely wonderful. However, let me give you another group who are saying something slightly different. So both Accenture and PwC, who between them recruit hundreds of thousands of graduates every year, last year and this year did it entirely virtually. Accenture used a metaverse with, and they both have data on how people felt. And they said, now we need to know a bit more about this. They said that the experience was as good as if they had met face to face. Now, maybe the truth is, Greg, that the face to face experience at PwC and Accenture is not as exciting. So it doesn't really matter what you do with it. But I mean, everything in my body says face-to-face is really important. But you do hear of organizations who are doing quite amazing experience stuff. And let me just give you one more point on this. I wrote an article in Harvard Business Review, which is this month, on managers. And I wrote it with Diana Gerson, who stepped down as the Chief Human Resource Officer at IBM. She teaches at Harvard now. And we get on really well. We wrote this wonderful article. In fact, we just talked about it today on a podcast. Diane and I have never met. We've never met face to face. She's, so I don't know. Honestly, Greg, I think that the jury's out on this one. I'm sure there's something really special about friendship. And I think you're right about young people, that actually the observation of young people. And I said this to Christy, who runs Optimus Connection. I said, well, hang on, Christy, what about young people? How do you help them? She said, we make it very explicit to them how you socialize this in this organization. And we tell them, what it is like. And we do it in a much more explicit, intentional way. They don't have to discover what this organization is. We tell them what it is. So this is why it's so exciting to be you and I, isn't it, Greg? Because we're watching all of this massive experiment playing out and asking all these unanswerable questions.
Yeah, I have to admit that when I read that story about the, metaverse boat ride of the new PwC employees, I was a little skeptical, right? I mean, to me, it's like when you go to if you and I were to have a drink together on the Zoom, I don't think it would feel quite. It still, to me, smacks of drinking alone.
Yeah.
Phone sex just doesn't seem like the same thing. So I think that you're right. The jury is out, but I think that some people would say that co-location is important, and then I think also some people would say that synchrony in time is also important. And you talk about the importance of serendipity. And I want to get to that because I think that's another thing that people have been worried about with this change in work that is driving kind of asynchronous communication and, kind of scheduled interactions. How do we replicate the kind of serendipity which so many organizations have, they struggled to create it in the real world? Does making things virtual make it harder, or is there a way that maybe it might even make it easier? Maybe we could kind of develop an algorithm for automating the interactions. We probably couldn't do that in the real world. We couldn't use an algorithm to make sure that Sally walks by, Sumit going to the bathroom at exactly the same time, right? That would be something that we wouldn't be able to engineer, but we might be able to engineer it online.
Yeah, that's a great question, isn't it? Well, early on in the pandemic, when everybody was writing about what was happening, so it wasn't just people like you and I who have been talking about the future of work for 15 years. It was everybody in the world, as far as I can see. They talked a lot about serendipity, and they talked about, we used to be in offices, and it was wonderful, and we'd just bump into people, and we'd, water cooler and blah blah, and it actually they were conjuring a picture of an office which actually didn't exist, as you know, because the research on offices before the pandemic showed that most people, especially in an open plan office, hated it so much. They went in, they put their headphones on, and they looked at their computers. So this idea that everyone was somehow, floating around, meeting people, I don't think that was ever really the case. But the fact is that it is really great and innovative and creative to bump into people who are different from you. I mean, we know that from network theory, don't we? That's those diversity of ideas is what makes for innovation. So the question, I think, is twofold. One is, as we go back to the office in a physical way, how do we create more serendipity? And secondly, the point you raised, Greg, which is there more that we can do virtually to create serendipity? And I think the answer to both of those is we can, but it takes intentional design. And when I named this new book, one of the names that I sort of played around with was the idea of intentional design. And actually the publishers didn't like it at all. But actually, in the case of offices, for example, people are now, if you look at Arup, one of the big engineering architectural firms, they move their teams. I think I mentioned this in the book, actually. They move their teams every 3 months because proximity is so important and so valuable. They don't want the same people to be sitting next to each other all the time. So they actually move them around. So that's really how, and they build, one of the things that Foster and Partners was telling me is that when they built, for example, the Apple building, there's a huge circulation process. You have to go, if you want to go to the loo, for example, you can't just, there's not a loo at the end of the corridor. You have to sort of promenade along this open space. And to get your coffee or go to the loo. And in doing so, the idea is you bump into other people. So I think the question of how do we design spaces that encourage serendipity is going to be the top of people's agenda as we try and persuade people to get into the office. But I think your point about virtual is also really important. And certainly the tech companies are always way ahead on this because obviously that's their product. So TCS, Tata Consulting Services, for example, they have a measure of every single team's sort of serendipity measure, in the sense of they look at their communication patterns, and the question they're asking is, did this team reach out to people beyond their boundaries? And they give them a measure of that. 10, yes, you did. 0, no, you didn't. And they provide that data back to the team, so the teams can then interrogate that data and say to themselves, are we too inward looking? Should we do more to reach out? And then, you get these things like random coffees. I actually hate the idea of having a random coffee, but apparently it goes really well, that every week or so, the algorithm chooses somebody for you to have coffee with, and you sit and have a virtual coffee with them. And apparently that's, a positive way of creating serendipity. So I think the point that we're both making is serendipity is really important. And to create it, you need more intentional design, and it has implications both for the location, but also for virtual.
Yeah, and I think certainly in academia, we've seen a bit of that, right? The office that I work in at Berkeley was designed in the 90s, and I think it was designed to discourage collaboration. It was like every professor's office is designed in such a way that provides maximum peace and quiet. You don't run into anybody. You're all by yourself.
Yep.
You have a view of the bay, and that's it. And periodically, people would stick their heads out from their hole, maybe to go grab a cup of coffee and then go back into their hole. But there weren't any kind of of the things you'd see in a tech office, where with couches and places to kind of bump into each other. And furthermore, they're hidden from the students. And they're separate from the staff. So the staff and the faculty don't meet. The faculty don't meet with each other. And the faculty certainly don't meet with the students. So the whole thing is designed for what we might think of as focused work, right? The kind of work that I think was the dominant view of academic
Mm.
research at the time that the building was built. And, if you really wanted to interact with people from other schools, which you probably interacted with more often than you interact with people from your own school in a different kind of faculty group, you would go to a conference, or you would have kind of the weekly seminar where you'd
Yeah.
fly someone in. And I found that since the pandemic, I wound up actually interacting with a much broader range of academics. And this podcast, for instance, I'd been thinking about it for 20 years, but I kept thinking I was going to have someone come and we would do an interview in front of an audience and blah, blah, blah. And then you need funding and that was just not possible. And this is, the kind of thing that's possible.
Just one other thing on that, Greg. I'm sure at some stage you've been to one of the Oxford or Cambridge colleges, but I was just reflecting on your point about Berkeley. And by the way, London Business School is the same. In fact, we have corridors where the professors sit. And when the architects designed it, they designed doors which had some glass in it so that you could see the professor. You know what we all did to that? We covered it all up. So, but actually the interesting thing about an Oxford college or a Cambridge college is that Oxford University is that the college faculty eat together. There's a common place called often the common place where faculty eat and drink and talk. And, I don't know if you've been to one of these college dinners. They're marvelous if you get a chance. They're very long tables. You sit around the table. In the really fancy ones, you have your first course in one room and then you move to another room for your port and dessert, which is often lit by candles. I know. So there we have it. But yes, I mean, this common space that we can all use to entertain ourselves and so on is really wonderful. And I think as we go back to thinking, why would we go into the office? What would the office bring that we don't get from home? One of the questions will be is how do I up the experiences of being there? That the friendship, the communality, the face-to-face stuff. That very important survey question. I have a friend at work. That is the number one predictor of whether you stay in a company. I have a friend at work. Sorry, back to bridging.
No, that's true. I think, different universities have different flavors of faculty, and obviously that's going to attract a different type of faculty. Most of my colleagues were thrilled that the pandemic allowed them to, not have to go to work. I live across the street from my office, so I would go to the office every day anyway, because I wanted this, I always kind of thought that having that separation was important, and these sort of switch on, switch off. I remember for a long time I would refuse to look at work emails when I was at home, and of course that went by the wayside a long time ago. But I think for some people they just never wanted to go to the office. But when we think about these boundary spanners, are they born or made?
Well, there is. I speak as a psychologist, and you probably know that there is data on the personality of boundary spanners. A couple of really interesting things about them. They tend to be inquisitive and curiosity is a born thing, actually. It's one of the big 5, psychological traits, how curious you are. And boundary spanners tend to be more curious. The other thing about boundary spanners, Greg, and I didn't mention it in this book, but I think I might have in a previous book, is the research suggests they tend not to get to the top of the organization because they don't build a power base. So, I mean, I would consider myself a boundary spanner, but I'm not the dean of I'm not the dean of London Business School. And I think that what happens with boundary spanners is that they build multiple constituency, they build multiple groups, but they go across rather than up. So you have to be a boundary spanner, you have to have probably not low power needs, but you can't be, if you're incredibly status driven, then it's hard to be a boundary spanner, because a boundary spanner is basically somebody who's prepared to, in terms of the narrative of their own lives, they're prepared to subsume the narrative of another group. So I span the boundary between academia and business people like, Diana Gerson, who I wrote with recently. And in both, and what you notice with boundary spanners is they adopt some of the identity of those groups when they're there. So they have lower needs for their own they're more like chameleons. And that is, that's a personality trait. Yeah. So they probably are born, but there's maybe masses you can do to become a boundary spanner, even if you weren't born a boundary spanner.
Well, you mentioned something about they have kind of a higher metacognition in the sense that they know how to calibrate themselves depending on what group or they're talking to.
I wouldn't use the word cognition. No, I think what they've got is they tend to have self-awareness. So boundary spanners tend to be more able to adapt their behavior to the circumstances that they find themselves in. So for our listeners, just to remind listeners, a boundary spanner is somebody who moves between two groups. So in the case of Greg and I, or certainly in the case of me and possibly of Greg, moving between silos, in my case, the silo of the practitioner, but it could also be, moving to, as you do, Greg, between one discipline and another. And each discipline has its own frameworks, its own language, its own theories. And actually spanning that can be very powerful, but it is difficult. My last two books, The 100-Year Life and The New Long Life, were both written with an economist. And I don't know if this is true, but a number of people have said to me, they think this is the first time as an individual level psychologist and a macroeconomist, he's not a micro, he's a macroeconomist, have actually worked together. But The 100-Year Life has sold more than 1 million copies. So we did get something right there.
Right. Yeah, no, of course. So I guess the question I would have is, one would think that that boundary spanners would suffer from the move to more remote work and the kind of centered work, because being a boundary spanner requires this kind of serendipity and the moving around and so forth, which might be a little more difficult. But I think that may not be entirely true, and one of the reasons might be that you talk about politics. Do you think that a lot of the people who were sort of resisting the migration away from the old workplace were the people who thrived in that workplace, right? That they had the personality type or maybe they had the political skills that enabled them to thrive in that environment. And so that's, of course, why they might have resisted it. And those people might not do as well in this new environment. And people with maybe, I don't want to say less political skills, but maybe different political skills would thrive in this new environment.
Yeah, that's a really interesting hypothesis, actually, Greg. I mean, two things you've mentioned here. One is, would boundary spanners do less well remotely? I think that's a really interesting question. I don't know the answer to that. It would be, we could spend time thinking about that, but I don't know the answer. The second is about, do you think that people who are skilled at politics in the old way of working might find it difficult in the new? And I think that's a really interesting point. One of the things that Diana Gerson and I said in our HBR article of this month, March 2022, called, I can't remember what we called it, something to do with managers anyway. One of the things that we said, and this was before the pandemic, but the pandemic accelerated, is the use of power. So, historically, managers were sort of powerful people. They controlled people's careers, they controlled the tasks that they do, they controlled the information they received, they controlled whether people got promoted. But that really is not the case anymore. And actually, where it used to be, it's all about me, me, the manager. It's now much more about it's us, it's we. So I'm not, in one of the early questions you asked is, did this accelerate things that were already in place? I think this is an acceleration. I think the changing in power structures was already in play, but I do think that the pandemic has accelerated the change in power structures. For example, part of the way that the CEO kept their power structure was the way they dressed, the sort of artifacts they had around them, and so on. And you've now seen, as I have, CEOs sitting in their room, in their shirts. In one case, I talked to a CEO last week with a cat on the desk, and I had to say to him at some stage, "Can you stop stroking the cat?" So, and that was not a power move on his part. It was him being himself. So I think that your point about power and politics is a really interesting point. And my guess is that a lot of this will, if we were to meet in a year's time, and I'm sure we will, Greg, then, we'll be talking about, well, what did we learn about that?
Well, Lynda, last question. And I think this ties together your book, The 100-Year Life, and the most recent book, Redesigning Work. You talk about portfolio life and how, we used to have these phases in our lives that were very distinct, right? You'd be a student, then you'd graduate, and that would it. No more learning, right? You'd go to the workplace and you'd work, and then, you'd retire, and then, you'd play golf or whatever people did in their retirement, right? And you point out that this has been kind of going away for a long time, and that we've moved towards what you call portfolio life. And I really like this term. And it kind of reminds me a bit, if I tie it back to the workplace, this idea, it's almost like the API-ification of the human experience, right? In that, we can kind of, mix and match and plug and play, and we can, our work life is kind of project oriented, right? And you actually describe a couple of these companies where you put someone on a retainer and then you have them do projects. And I've seen my students and my former students, when you say to them, "Hey, I'd like to have you come in and speak to my class as a representative of Microsoft," and the class is in 6 weeks. They're like, "Well, hey, 6 weeks from now, hey, I might not be at Microsoft. I just had drinks with a friend of mine, and I said, I haven't seen you in a week. What's happened?" He's like, "Well, I switched jobs, quit on Tuesday night, started a new one Wednesday morning." So it's not just that we're hopscotching temporally, but also synchronously. People have multiple jobs and side gigs, and I'm teaching at 3 universities, and I work with a dozen companies, and I've got the podcasting, and so if companies refuse to acknowledge this portfolio life, then I think they're going to lose out on some of the best people, right? Is this?
Yeah.
Is there a tension between portfolio life and kind of really getting the kind of buy-in that companies want in order to build greatness?
Thank you. Yeah, thanks so much for making that connection, Greg, because I think it's a really important connection between the 100-year life, which means you work until you're 70 at a time of massive technological disruption, which means you have to change what you do, not infrequently, and you have to do that on your own. And what's happening with the redesign of work, which is fundamentally about flexibility. The redesign of work from the individual perspective is about more flexibility with regard to when and where they work, time and place. And so if you bring those two together, then suddenly you get enough flexibility to be able to make the investments that you need to build this multi-stage life, as we call it, where you do different things in different sequences in a much more individualistic way. So the two are absolutely brought together, and the companies who don't redesign work will fail to attract and retain people who want more choice and flexibility about their life and their life path. And I suspect that's a lot of people, Greg.
Yeah, I think you're right. Lynda, it's been great chatting with you. We could probably chat
Thank
for a
you,
long
Greg.
time. We barely scratched the surface of your books. And, if you're interested, not only keep up with Lynda's publications in HBR, MIT Sloan Management Review, but also you've got this wonderful website connected to the book, which gives employers the ability to do this 4-stage kind of process on their own companies and work through the redesigning work process on their own. Thank you so much, Lynda.
Thank you so much, Greg. It's been such a pleasure speaking on Unsiloed. Thank you.
This is Unsiloed, brought to you by Alumni FM, connecting people through stories.